Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is, What's Your Point of View? A conversation with former Italian Prime Minister Mario Monti at the 2025 Spring Meeting. The Antitrust Law Section's annual Spring Meeting in Washington, D.C. is a chance for practitioners, government enforcers, and economists from around the world to exchange ideas about competition law, consumer protection, and data privacy law and policy. While on site at this year's spring meeting, Section Chair-Elect Renata Hesse interviewed Mario Monti, who served as the European Commissioner for Competition from 1999 to 2004 and as Prime Minister of Italy from 2011 to 2013. What are his views on the past, present, and future of international competition enforcement? Why does he believe that it's critically important to preserve the historically cooperative relationship between the U.S. and European competition regimes? Here is their conversation.
Well, hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm your special guest host today, Renata Hesse, and I have a very special guest to talk to today, which is the former Commissioner for Competition and former Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Monti.
Delighted to be here with you, Renata.
We're very glad to have you. So I thought maybe we would start with your story of how you got into competition. How did that happen in your life?
I was an academic economist, more in monetary economics than in competition. But in the late 80s, I was called by the Italian government to be a member of the committee to produce the first ever draft of a competition law in Italy. I found that interesting, that was conducive to the first antitrust agency in Italy. And a few years later, I would have found myself doing that job in Brussels at the European Commission as competition commissioner.
So that was when I first knew about you or learned about you, because I worked on the US v. Microsoft case.
I remember that name.
One of the many cases that we in the U.S. during that period had that were cross-border, shall we say, where the European Commission and the U.S. Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission were looking at the same transactions. What do you remember about how the U.S. and the European Commission worked together at that time?
I have a memory of a very, very deep cooperation at all levels. That is the technical level of our respective teams, of economists and lawyers, and then at the level of the decision makers. There was an unquestionable common purpose of doing the best in examining a case, and the best in terms of the solutions found. And at the same time, I think we were all aware that we were building a cooperation across the Atlantic that would stay there well beyond the specific case, and was going to build an environment that would be at any rate good for companies, for multinationals, seeking, for example, authorization for a merger out of many, many jurisdictions, and at the same time good for the consumers. So I think it was a highly motivating cooperation, even though we might have disagreed on the specifics of a few cases.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because I do recall there were some very well publicized disagreements between the U.S. and the European Commission during that period, but it didn't seem to diminish the desire, at least, to speak to one another?
On the contrary, I can frankly say that, yes, we were considered to be more aggressive, one would say today, than our US counterparts. And in fact, in subsequent years, I think we can say that US antitrust has become a bit more proactive. But at the same time, we learned a lot, for example, in the use of economic analysis done by the DOJ and the FTC. And when I did, as European Competition Commissioner, an overall reform 2 or 3 years later, we introduced for the first time a chief competition economist at DG Competition, which was really one product of our cooperation. There was a process of mutual learning. Of course, the US experience with antitrust was much more time-honored than the relatively young European experience. Maybe as a counterpart, we had the vigor and enthusiasm that many times goes with youth, and I think it was a great cooperation.
One of the things that I've always thought about is working, for example, in some of the multilateral organizations like the International Competition Network and OECD, is that countries around the world have a very different way of coming into having an antitrust authority. Some come from state-owned economies, some come from economies that are more comfortable with regulation, and the U.S. has a very long-standing desire to get away from regulation and to let markets be dictated more by competition. What impact do you think that difference in experience between the U.S. and Europe has had on how competition law has developed in those two places?
Whatever impact this difference of histories may have had, I think it was much lower than it would have been the case otherwise, precisely thanks to the bilateral cooperation and more globally thanks to the multilateral cooperation in ICN. The trick with ICN, for example, was, I thought, that it did not seek to achieve strong convergence or hard convergence through harmonization of legislations in different jurisdictions. That would have been pretty demanding, very heroic, probably impossible. But it was a process of soft convergence, of cultures about competition. What do we want to achieve? Why what we want to achieve is good for the economy and for growth? And why it is good if we achieve some convergence in the methodologies we use in assessing cases of competition or in fighting cartels or whatever. And why is it good if, to the extent possible, the outcomes converge? So I found it a highly pragmatic but quite powerful way of becoming more like-minded and more similar in the way of operation. All of this was very reassuring for the business community, by the way, because they had to confront many different competition authorities, different longitudes and latitudes, but the more the approaches were converging, the less disturbing and unpredictable the process was for the companies.
I've always felt that ICN had a very practical bent to it, that it was really focused on best practices and developing some of that kind of convergence, that soft convergence that you're talking about, in countries with less developed or newly emerging competition regimes, which seemed quite beneficial. How do you see ICN's role as being different from OECD's?
That's a very good point, because there are many common aspects, but when the ICN was created in the early 2000s, cooperation among competition authorities under the umbrella of OECD was already there and going well, but the ICN pioneered a method of trying to reach a higher number of countries, not just OECD members, and also countries where the status, the tradition, and the authority of the competition agency were very, very different. And I found it interesting, for example, to note that one benefit for all the competition agencies of belonging to the ICN is that in the conversations with their respective governments and political powers, they tended to gain a respect that wasn't there before, because especially in some countries of the emerging world, a competition authority is rather a minimalistic creature, not like in the US or the European Union. But for the competition authority, for the head of the competition authority in such a country to be able to say, look, I belong to a common culture, which does tend to consider that certain things should be done in this way and not in that other way, I thought gave more value to their activities. So spread more effectively what we considered, and I hope still consider, to be the positive message of competition.
Now, you happen to be in Washington this week, not for the spring meeting, is that correct?
Exactly. I'm in Washington for the annual plenary meeting of the Trilateral Commission. That is a well-known body created in the early 70s by people like Jimmy Carter, David Rockefeller, Brzezinski, and others, the purpose of which was to establish a dialogue, a conversation, not only among the politicians, but also among the business people, the intellectuals, the academics of the US, Europe, and Japan. It then gradually evolved into involving North America, Europe in an enlarged sense, and Asia. And I've been very much involved in all this. This time, because we rotate among the three parts of the world, this time, luckily, I should say, the meeting is in Washington and comes at an extremely useful moment in order to put to test the usefulness of the Trilateral Commission, because we all have in our souls, in our genes, I would say, the built-in interest of a smooth and effective, which does not necessarily mean very nice at each time, cooperation among these three areas. And I, as a committed European who has participated to a small extent in the construction of the European Union, but also somebody who has been studying in the US, working very much with the US when I was competition commissioner, and then when I was Prime Minister of Italy at a difficult moment. It was President Bush in the first case, President Obama in the second case. I cannot really live with a fundamental conflict between the US and the EU, and I'll do whatever is possible to persuade both parties that is not a sustainable position.
So we find ourselves at a moment where there is some level of conflict, at least in words.
Maybe beyond that.
Between the U.S. and Europe. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the development of that. Obviously, you feel very strongly that that's not a good place for the world to end up, but I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on your thinking on that.
Well, certainly the US and President Trump distinctly have a very good point in criticizing Europe for not having done enough and paid enough for our defense. I've been saying this for a number of years now in Europe, saying that even if paradoxically one day we had an American president not putting pressure on Europe to increase its contribution to NATO, we should at any rate have done more and paid more for our defense. Also because the US, it was clear already a few years ago, was probably not like to be forever the most stable country in terms of its international policies. And we are in a moment where we have a bad conscience, because it is true that we have not done enough for our defense. It's true that the defense of Europe defends also the US, to be fair. And at the same time, we are in a moment where the US is much less interested in Europe and in the protection of Europe. And so this is a point, I think, for President Trump, a topic which should be handled with care from both sides. What concerns me very much as a European who believes in a modern market economy and in international cooperation is to see the US, which at the same time gives clearly the sense of a more, I say it politely, imperialistic approach to the rest of the world, but at the same time, being aware or not, retreats and withdraws the US from a number of positions of leadership that it has naturally constructed over time. For example, the US does not seem very interested anymore in being the moral and political leader of liberal democracies around the world. It gives the impression of feeling very comfortable in the dialogue and cooperation with some autocratic governments. And Italy, Europe, of course, is a bit perplexed when it sees President Trump feeling closer to President Putin than to the rest of Europe. Also, we have always believed that the US was naturally the leader of modern democratic capitalism, based on principles like the separation of power between economic and politics, based on competition, based on some independence agencies within the economic and institutional system. After all, antitrust laws have been created in the US in the first place, but also independent bodies like the Federal Reserve System. All this has been replicated thanks to the persuasion and the good example of the US in Europe. In Germany first, under post-war occupation, then throughout the European Union, which, by the way, is not, I'm sorry to contradict President Trump, something that Europe has invented to go against the US. European integration is something that the US have invented in a visionary and generous process with the Marshall Plan and the setting up of the OSCE after World War II to disseminate in Europe the good practices of structural reforms for growth and the concept of integration, much to the benefit of avoiding another war in Europe and helping the transatlantic cooperation towards growth. And it's a shock for me, for example, to see that the US does no longer appear to seek to be the leader of modern democratic capitalism, because all of a sudden it's not very interested in keeping some separation between economic and political power, or in the principles of competition. And again, the US has, of course, been, with a lot of success, the champion of creating some governance of globalization through the international organizations. Some have functioned better than others, but on the whole it was the US guiding the process. And now we see the US no longer convinced that this is a worthwhile process. By the way, I fear a bit that this might once again, like a few years ago, give President Xi Jinping the not totally well-deserved status of leader of free trade worldwide and of multilateralism, but it is the withdrawal of leadership of the US in these fields that has these consequences. So I hope Europe, with its modest resources and authority, will help the US to understand that if this modality of governance were to persist, then this would create a number of problems also for the standing of the US over time.
Since I know we're taking your valuable time briefly to competition and competition policy and the role that it has played in modern economic expansion and globalization to a large degree, and how you see the through line of competition policy helping us navigate a new economic period, I think, that we find ourselves in, that's very different from the post-war period where European integration and the Marshall Plan played such a significant role.
Yes, the horizon is not very bright here, but we must try to dispel the clouds. And it is very much a matter of cloud, because much of the problems linked to competition today have to do with the digital platforms, the digital economy, with its immense benefit for the economy and for society and for growth and for culture, and at the same time with the huge problems that they pose, again, to the economy, to society, to culture, to the youth, and to the ordinary playing of the democratic process. For example, talking of US and EU, we mentioned earlier in this conversation that when in the early 2000s there were some cases of conflict between Washington and Brussels in antitrust, we used them to generate a higher level of cooperation. So now there may well be, as regards in particular the regulation and competition enforcement on digital platforms, some non-convergences or some conflicts between the US and the EU. I wonder whether it would not be a good idea to try and preempt this by having an intense dialogue, not only between the respective competition authorities, which I know is going on, but also among the leadership of the one country and one union, in order to deepen and make more strong the awareness that there might be occasional divergences in individual cases, but for the US and the EU to have a trajectory of common approach over the next few decades as regards the environment for digital platforms is something of great interest for these two entities and for the world. And I think that one day or the other, also China will play in this playground. But probably it would have been, it would be very helpful if in the meantime, passing over their difficulties in specific cases, the EU and the US had been developing some reasonable and agreed principles to which at that point probably China would have to come as well if it wants to participate in a rather organized and more or less harmonious system.
It's been a number of years since you were the Commissioner for Competition, but I wonder how you respond to the criticism that we've heard even in the last day or two that the DMA and other actions taken by European countries against the technology companies are in some way attacks on U.S. businesses. How would you respond to that?
I understand that this might be the perception, even the good faith perception, because there is a regulation that is conceived for everybody, for every firm, but at the same time it is true that that space is populated more by American-based platforms than by platforms or entities of other countries or of the European Union. But Europe has a rather good record of applying, in particular, its competition rules, having in mind the interest of the single market, which is a space of almost 500 million citizens and companies, where there are certain rules concerning competition, and they have to be applied irrespective of the nationality of the company, because what is in question is primarily the interest of the consumer of that huge area. And for example, and I take one of the most controversial cases, when we prohibited GE Honeywell in 2001 or 2, even though it had been approved already in Washington, I think it was the DOJ, that was perceived by many in America as a trade war, as a discrimination against America, but it was nothing of that sort, and in fact the courts then clarified this. It's because the public opinion in America that is not aware of the fact that the EU Commission has its duties, and for example, almost every day it goes against governments of member states, for example, for granting state aid to companies not within the criteria and the laws of the European Union. So it's normal that one side, the American business community or government in this case, perceive certain actions out of Brussels as if they were targeted at the US. This is not the case. I mean, as I said to the press at the time of GE Honeywell, go in Berlin, go in all the 16 Länder in Germany. Each of them has had to change after a century their laws concerning the state guarantees to the public banks because the European Commission has put them in conformity with the European rules. And so the Commission there went against its own shareholders. But all this requires a huge and deep and constant cultural dialogue to avoid misunderstandings. Let's try not to destroy something that has been a product of various centuries of interaction between Europe and America in terms of creating democracies, strengthening them, having them overcome crisis. I cannot imagine that we will not be able together to find solutions to the divergences between Europe that has been saved twice by Americans, and America, which I believe owes a lot to Europe in the very genetics of its foundations of such a great state.
That seems like a perfect note to end on, and I want to just thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon, and it's been a real privilege for me to get a chance to sit down with you and talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust Section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.